Insurance isn't one size fits all, and shopping for it shouldn't feel like squeezing into something that just doesn't fit. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they show you options that fit your budget. Enough hunting for discounts, trying to calculate rates, and tinkering with coverages. Maybe you're picking out your very first policy, or maybe you're just looking for something that works better for you and your family. Either way, they make it simple to see your options. No guesswork, no surprises. Ready to see how easy and fun shopping for car insurance can be? Visit Progressive.com and give the Name Your Price tool a try. Take the stress out of shopping and find coverage that fits your life, on your terms. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Now, strangers, we love a good story about psychics. Not that we don't love all kinds of strange tales, and not that we have to defend ourselves to you, you lovely little weirdos, but there's just something really engrossing about a tale that revolves so clearly around a human element. Aliens and cryptids and ghosts, oh my, are all plenty of fun, but people are unpredictable. And people want, often very badly, to be special. Who among us didn't, as a child, fantasize about reading minds, or getting that parchment invitation to some magical school far away, or going all Matilda on everyone and developing telekinetic powers? We yearn from a young age to be exceptional, to break rules, or to transcend them, to be the greatest, or even to be the only, to be unique. Most of us grow out of that desire and eventually come back down to earth because things need doing and taxes need paying. And so when people retain that self-designated aura of specialness, we're suspicious. Those people are obviously selling something, or maybe they're delusional, often both. But we're captivated nonetheless. Such was the reception when Matthew Manning, a British teenager, popped out of obscurity in the 1970s. There were those who were skeptical of him, but there were many, many more who were simply enraptured. According to the Daily Independent Journal, Matthew was 19 years old when the media first took notice of him, but his story began when he was much younger. At age 12, Matthew was the oldest of 3 children and living in Cambridge, England, with their parents. It was an idyllic mid-century childhood, or it would have been if something was not so very badly wrong. According to the Independent Journal, the Manning family was being bothered, persistently, by a poltergeist. It was one of the ones that had a habit of throwing around furniture and stashing cutlery under beds and sending bar carts careening down hallways. Good old poltergeist stuff. The Mannings, though, were not enjoying themselves. Per the Calgary Albertan, it was mostly Matthew and his siblings who saw the ghostly activity, and they were upset by it. And enough things were going missing, reappearing, and moving over the course of 3 months that the Manning parents had to call in backup, namely the help of a psychical researcher and a math professor named Dr. George Owen from the nearby Cambridge University. According to the Daily Independent, Dr. Owen conducted an investigation of the Manning family home and concluded that Matthew was most likely the cause of the trouble, not because he was a 12-year-old who thought he was funny, but because he had burgeoning psychic powers of his own. The Albertan wrote that once Matthew was identified as the vector, things got weirder for the adolescent boy and for his family. Objects stopped moving around, but, quote, psychic graffiti started popping up on the walls in the family home. As the Albertan explained, quote, most of this unexplained writing took the form of names and dates, scrawled in an archaic-looking style of handwriting. According to the Evening News, when Matthew was sent to boarding school, his schoolmates began reporting objects flying off the ground whenever he was nearby. The headmaster was made aware, and Matthew was almost expelled on several occasions for being disruptive. Really, it was the spirits that were being disruptive, but potato potato. As he grew up, Matthew's skills only diversified. Per the Independent, he gained the ability to bend metal. He could make things appear and disappear at will, and he claimed to be able to channel the dead, relaying messages from Greek bishops and recreating art by Da Vinci and Picasso by his own hand. Before he turned 18, Matthew Manning reunited with Dr. Owen in Toronto so that Owen could truly study his brain with new technology. An EEG scan was performed to measure Matthew's brain waves, and apparently produced a pattern that Dr. Owen had never seen before, a so-called, quote, ramp function. Now, we looked up some neuroscience papers to try and better understand what Dr. Owen was talking about and why our ramp function was special or different. And we are not neuroscientists, so take this with a big grain of salt. But ramping activity appears to be pretty well understood. According to an article in Current Opinion in Behavioral Sciences, it's defined as an increase or decrease in neuron activity as one completes a task. Again, grain of salt. But we're not sure, in short, why RAM function might have been special in the early 1970s canon of neuroscience. But the buzz was enough to secure Matthew Manning a book deal. Most of what we've told you about Matthew Manning's life thus far has been from articles reviewing and discussing that very book, which would eventually be called The Link. Matthew Manning himself is the link, in case that wasn't clear. That is, the link to capabilities beyond our understanding of the human mind. The Link was released in England in 1974 and per the Wichita Falls in the United States the following year. There were many articles in our newspaper archives that breathlessly recounted the book's key plot points. We've laid out most of that for you already, and we'll revisit some in a moment. But suffice it to say, on both sides of the Atlantic, that 19-year-old Matthew Manning was suddenly very famous. He even popped up in Georgia's The Macon News in 1975 to clarify that he had neither a girlfriend nor a boyfriend, and that his talents, quote, may lead to a cure for autistic children. We're not even going to attempt to unpack that problematic statement, but you're welcome to try yourselves. Just, don't email us about it. The Daily Independent Journal likened Matthew to another famous psychic, one Uri Geller. If you're one of our Patreon supporters, you can find a blog post we wrote about Uri and his spoon-bending antics way back in our archives. There's a story there that's very much worth knowing. But for now, we'll let the Daily Independent Journal explain their comparison in their own words. Quote, Manning may not be as handsome as Geller, whom women swoon over, though that's a matter of debate. But many have pointed out how much, with his long hair and beard, Matthew Manning resembles pictures of the young Jesus. The journal continues. What has the psychic buff so excited is that Matthew not only bends spoons and keys as Geller does, but he gets messages from the dead. Strangers, we cannot imagine that Uri Geller was especially pleased to be shown up by a 19-year-old Jesus lookalike, but to be fair, we also can't imagine that being called less hot than Uri Geller was a ton of fun either. In any case, Matthew Manning was suddenly and extremely in the zeitgeist, a position that we do not envy. According to the night newspapers, he was touring both the UK and the US to promote his book throughout the mid-70s and commanding huge crowds at book events, even though he refused to show off his purported powers. Quote, Manning has refused to demonstrate, saying he only does so when scientists are present. He explained, I dislike commercial exploitation of something deserving of more serious attention. I'm not conducting a psychic circus. Psychic Circus is a great name for a band, and we will be putting that in our back pocket, but we need to move on. In spite of, or perhaps because of, Matthew's caginess about his gifts, he had quite a following, and it became the sort of feedback loop wherein there was no bad press. Take the Sunday Mirror, a UK paper that partnered with Matthew on a stunt, or experiment in their words, in 1977. The premise was this: Matthew would go to the top of London's post office tower for 15 minutes on a Sunday evening and would broadcast 3 mental images: a color, a number, and a shape. Mirror readers in London would open their minds and try to catch what Matthew was broadcasting, and then they'd send in postcards with their impressions of what Matthew had been trying to transmit. On August 14, 1977, a week after the broadcast, the Mirror had tabulated all of their postcards and ran an article with their results. Matthew had been thinking of the color green, the number 123, and the shape of a house. The Mirror wrote that 2,500 readers had sent in postcards, and of those, 2% had correctly guessed the number, 3.5% had guessed a house, but a whopping 25% had correctly guessed the color. Concerning that last one, a legitimate statistician, Michael Haslam of the Institute of Statisticians, commented to the Mirror, "Your readers seem to have hit the jackpot. You see, 25% beat the odds. Of the 6 colors most likely to pop into someone's head, red, yellow, blue, green, orange, and purple, green has a 17% or so chance of occurring randomly. So, what made people guess green? Could postcard results even be considered legitimate science? These are questions that you'll have to ask yourselves late at night because, well, we don't have the answers." But Matthew Manning? Well, he was on a roll as the decade wrapped up. In 1979, the Mind Science Foundation ran tests that they published in a psychical research journal, tests that they said proved that Matthew's powers were more reliable than just serendipity or chance. We don't know much about their experimental models, but we imagine it was similar to the Mirror's situation. Matthew knew things that he shouldn't know, or placed thoughts into people's heads, or something of the like. Spoon bending was probably involved because it always was back then. Strangers, on the whole, it certainly seemed that Matthew Manning was a psychic worth his salt, or at least one that news outlets had a very hard time tearing down. That is, except for one strange thing. There was a string of articles from Matthew's hometown paper. Articles which predate pretty much everything we've shared with you so far. Articles that came out right as his book The Link debuted, and they were scathing and methodical takedowns of the book and of Matthew himself. Funny that they didn't get the same attention. The earliest critical article we found about Matthew Manning was in the November 5th, 1974 issue of the Cambridge Evening News. Now, as we mentioned, much of the press had been glowing, or at least took Matthew's claims in good fun, but the Cambridge Evening News wasn't having it. You're about to hear a lot from the Evening News because it seems that they were pretty ready to put this 19-year-old psychic through the ringer. Introducing what was not to be just one article on Matthew, but a full-blown series, the Evening News wrote, "Our writers have compiled a detailed analysis of the book and spoken to many people who are in a position to throw some light on the claims made by Matthew." The headline of this article pulled no punches, reading, "Matthew Manning, is he a genius or a joker?" And if that was somehow too tame for your liking, the article's lead takes it up a notch. Matthew Manning's extraordinary book The Link is likely to finish up in more than a few wastepaper baskets. It will not be projected there by poltergeist activity, but will be thrown by very normal people who find it impossible to accept that even a small part of the story is true. Strangers, please know that if we had time or were allowed, we would just read you the entirety of this article because it is absolutely savage. It is a call-out masquerading as a book review, and shots were fired. Such a media pylon eviscerating a teenager's work would not be seen again until the release of Rebecca Black's Friday. The short version is this. The paper argued that Matthew Manning's story could not possibly be true, as it was substantiated neither by sources other than Matthew nor by anyone's understanding of Matthew. And the Evening News would go on to publish not one, not two, but 6 more feature-length articles over the course of a week, all painstakingly picking apart anecdotes in the link, disproving some and simply ridiculing others. The first piece pointed out that the adults in Matthew's life seemed suspiciously willing to believe the stories that he'd tell as a boy, of furniture flying around and household objects like detergent bottles seeming to have minds of their own. The Manning parents, by Matthew's own admission, seldom if ever saw these things happening, but they believed 12-year-old Matthew without question that it was ghosts, not an adolescent prank. The second Evening News article zeroes in on Matthew's stories of his time at school, a boarding school, which conveniently he never names in his book. Nor does he name any teachers, headmasters, or peers, all of whom, in Matthew's stories, allegedly believed that he had psychic powers and were extremely chill about it. As the Evening News wrote about his time at school, quote, "The boys reported weird goings-on to their parents, who wanted to know from the headmaster what he was doing about it. Although the headmaster continued to fret, at no time did he appear to have set up the sort of investigation which was needed. Also difficult to understand is the total absence of fear. After each incident, the boys turned the lights off and went back to sleep." The point being made here is, again, that the people around Matthew were very blasé about this whole paranormal activity thing. There was no investigation, no contemporaneous reporting, no corroborations from other people at the school. Surely, someone, somewhere, would have said something about this before Matthew had the chance to write a book. The Evening News doesn't propose why no one did, but it does cast the whole thing with very pointed suspicion. Their next article was about Matthew's insistence that he was friends with the ghosts of Picasso, Da Vinci, and Beatrix Potter, about which the Evening News wrote, "If there is a point in Matthew's story where the credibility gap turns into a chasm, it is when he goes into details of his conversations with the ghosts." You see, as the news points out, Matthew's ghosts knew things about modern technology that they simply shouldn't have known. And Matthew would reproduce works of art, apparently channeling his ghostly friends, but once blindfolded, he lost the ability to draw, which, to be fair, most of us do. The next day, the Evening News dropped another article, this one making fun of Matthew's apparent ability to make things that he wished for appear out of thin air, including but not limited to beer, an apple pie, firewood, and a Ringo Starr record. We can't think of a better list of things a teenage boy would wish for in the 70s, save for the firewood. Not sure what was going on with that. Moving on. An article published the following day, we're now at November 9th, 1974, was an absolute banger about a series of ghostly signatures that apparently appeared on Matthew Manning's wall. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 signatures materialized in Matthew's bedroom in Linton, England, as though scrawled there by spirits. In the book, Matthew presented these signatures, along with alleged scratching sounds, as evidence that there were ghosts living in the walls. Judging by the dates that the ghosts thoughtfully added to their signatures, it was a small town's worth of people from the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The Evening News took a closer look at one of the signatures in particular, that of a Kathleen Ferrier, accompanied by the year 1692. Why this particular signature stuck out to them is unclear, but the news did one of the greatest things that an intrepid researcher can do. They asked a local librarian for her thoughts, and that librarian checked the county records and found that the name Kathleen didn't crop up in England until the 1800s. So there were no records of a Kathleen Ferrier who had lived in 1692, much less died then. What's more, the news then had a team of librarians examine all the signatures from Matthew's wall, which somehow they'd gotten permission to photograph. And those experts found a few very interesting things. For one, all of the names were spelled consistently with 20th century conventions, which should not have been the case. Even names like John and Mary were improvised and pretty much spelled however people liked in the 17th and 18th centuries. So that was a strike against Matthew. So was the fact that only about a tenth of the signatures on the wall appeared in the census data for that period, and those were extremely common names. And the letters that made up those signatures were very much 20th century ones. A modern J, a modern H, a modern E, and not what you'd expect to see from many centuries before. And then, of course, there's the fact that all the signatures were definitely written by the same person. We told you it was a banger, strangers. But here's the thing. In spite of the rather comprehensive signature debunking, Matthew's supporters wrote into the Cambridge Evening News to offer defenses of their miracle maker. And we need to be honest here, some of their defenses were very valid indeed. The Evening News ended up running one such letter about a week after their series on Matthew ended. This letter was written by a man named Andrew Barron of Trumpington, England, who we must assume was the winner of the most British name and place of 1974. Andrew's letter to the paper opened tit-to-tat with some spice. It is one thing to write a biased or distorted article. It is quite another to print untruths. The rest of the letter could just as well be comments on a web news article in 2023. Andrew of Trumpington made the case that the news had gotten such a wonderful story, slanted it, took things out of context, and worst of all, printed things that are quite blatantly untrue. More specifically, Andrew wrote that the articles ignored the entire period where Matthew's brain was studied in a lab. They ignored passages where, in fact, Matthew's fellow schoolmates were deeply upset by his gifts. He argued that their sensational headlines obscured something important, that the news didn't actually come up with a more practical solution for the events Matthew recounted beyond, "It's probably fake." In his letter, Andrew even cited page numbers from his copy of The Link to directly refute the paper, which we really do respect. And whether because the news cycle had simply moved on or the editorial team had simply had enough, Andrew's letter is the last word in the Evening News Matthew Manning saga. But as we know, Matthew Manning's saga didn't end there, not by a long shot. As we told you at the start of this episode, he held the media's attention for far longer than he held the Evening News feature team. There were sensational studies of his brain and his apparent gifts through the late 70s and into the early 1980s. But Matthew Manning has lived a quiet life over recent decades. As far as we can tell, he's still alive today. He'd be 67 or so. And if he's had any more trouble with poltergeist or he's kept up materializing Ringo Starr records, he's kept it to himself. That's the kicker about stories like this. Try as the skeptics might, early to the punch as they might be, there's very rarely an easy way to prove that the likes of Matthew Manning are fraudsters. One can offer possibilities or even debunk a particular stunt, as modern magicians like Penn and Teller are now apt to do. But to thoroughly unravel a story like The Link, one that's so tightly wound around one man, it would require knowing what thread to pull at and where to even start. And Matthew Manning, for his part, hasn't given us much of a hint as to his weak point. So it comes back to that idea of belief. the very thing that made Matthew Manning famous in the first place. Whether he believed in his own powers in good faith is up for debate, but it certainly seems like the people around him, in his childhood and early adulthood, believed him, and many millions of people reading and writing newspapers around the world did too. If belief is all it takes, Matthew Manning isn't all that different from a 12-year-old convinced that she can read minds. Or with that enough practice, she might be able to tip over that cup of water from the other side of the room. Something materializes when we believe. Whether it's the thing we believe in or some other sense of meaning entirely, well, we'll leave that up to you to decide. We're just a podcast, after all. We hope you'll join us next time for another premium exclusive episode of One Strange Thing. Oh, and if you wouldn't mind, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on your favorite app. It helps us find more listeners.